An Inman-line ship, the SS City of Boston was a 305-foot-long, 2,213-ton iron hull steamship built and launched on November 15, 1864. Inside her, she had 2 steam engines which gave power to her single screw, combined with her sails, allowing her to achieve a speed of 12 knots. In 1865, this gorgeous ship had her maiden voyage, taking her on her first crossing from Queenstown to New York. The city of Boston then began typical commercial service, ferrying passengers across the ocean. In November 1868, the city of Boston rescued the passengers of the ship Wabeno. Back then, if a ship became distressed at sea, the only hope for those on board was that another ship came by. The passengers of the Wabeno were lucky. Their ship had struck an iceberg and was sinking. Though the city of Boston rescued passengers from a doomed ship, those on board her, just a few years later, would not be so lucky. The city of Boston enjoyed a 6-year career before she would disappear, which seems to have been mostly uneventful, save for a reported incident of her becoming grounded off New York in a winter storm in December of 1868. Though there is some debate among historians about if this event ever actually occurred. On January 28, 1870, the city of Boston left Halifax for Liverpool. On this voyage, she was carrying multiple important and prominent figures of the day, between 191 and 207 total passengers and crew. Some of those on board her included important businessmen and military officers. Being on the ship on this crossing would have been fascinating to see some of these high-profile individuals interact, and it makes the unknowns of her loss all the more interesting. Aside from these high-profile individuals, there were multiple families with children on board the steamship as well. From what I've been able to find, the ship's captain was a man named William Forbes. She disappeared on this voyage and has never been seen again. The last time the city of Boston and her 191 passengers were sighted was when they left port. 2 days after leaving, a violent gale hit the area. Over the years, there have been multiple proposed theories to explain the loss of the city of Boston. When the ship left, she reportedly was overladen by 18 to 20 inches. If the gale struck the area she was in, bad weather perhaps could have caused her to capsize, or perhaps even an encounter with a rogue wave could explain it. The idea of poor weather sinking the ship is the most likely in my opinion, but there are many other theories out there as well. A collision with an iceberg could also explain the loss of the ship, and if this is the fate that befell her, then talk about some twisted irony. The fact that the very thing she saved passengers of another ship from, no one would come and save her own from. A reported sighting of the ship came on February 28th, when she was possibly sighted off the coast of Ireland, limping along with reportedly broken cylinders in her engines. The validity of this sighting is unknown. Another ship called the Russell reported that they found a wrecked ship sunk 32 miles southwest of the Smalls Lighthouse. Only the funnel of this sunk steamship jetted above the water to announce her presence. But some thought that the wreck was the city of Boston. Between the 16th and 17th of March, it was falsely reported on both sides of the ocean that the city of Boston had arrived safely in port following a tumultuous crossing. People's joy that the ship was safe was very short-lived. The story of her safe arrival in port was quickly corrected. The city of Boston had never arrived, and the ship was still missing. The newspaper even offered a reward for any information that led to the identity of who wrote the hoax story. By the end of March 1870, the Inman line said that they were confident that the city of Boston was afloat and that she'd eventually come to port safely, even if it was under the power of her sails. But vessels traveling the same route as her reported no traces of the ship as the months passed. Aside from these sightings, multiple proposed messages from the missing ship found their way to shore across the high seas. A piece of wood with the inscription, "City of Boston is sinking, February 11th, washed ashore on April 25th of the year she vanished." A message in a bottle that washed up in Cornwall in 1870 reported that the city of Boston had a collision with another ship and it was sinking. Another message found in a stone bottle at Waterloo on May 6th with the date of February 4th claimed the ship was on fire, sinking, and that her propellers were broken. The city of Boston's propellers had broken in an earlier voyage and had been replaced. Back then, it was not uncommon for steamships to break down, hence why they still had sails. At the time of her loss, her original 3-blade propeller had been replaced with a 2-bladed one. The captain of the City of Brooklyn, another inland line vessel, claimed that he did not believe the new propeller was strong enough to let the City of Boston handle itself in foul weather. And if this was true, then it might have proved fatal. None of these messages we just covered were signed with the names that matched the passenger and crew lists. However, another bottle with a letter in it that was found on Staten Island on April 19th was signed with a name that matched one of the steerage passengers. This message claimed that the City of Boston had caught fire and was swamped as the crew tried to launch the lifeboats. And another message that was found, which was also signed by a name that was on the passenger list, claimed the City of Boston was half full of water at the time of writing. It said that the ship was sinking and that she would be gone in less than 2 hours, and it requested that the writer's son be cared for. The authenticity of these messages is unknown. One other theory even said that a bomb had been placed on the ship to sink it for insurance fraud. While this could make for an interesting film or historical fiction story, it is likely that this didn't actually happen. One other story came out in 1900 that suggested that the City of Boston never sank, but was actually a floating derelict out in the ocean. In 1900, an individual named E. Thompson signed up to be a cabin boy on the vessel J.G. Norward, and 3 weeks after the vessel left Texas, it ran into a severe storm. The whole crew, save Thompson, were washed overboard by a huge wave, but the Norward didn't sink. Thompson, the only survivor, clung on board as the vessel began drifting. Days later, the ship became tangled in seaweed in the Sargasso Sea, which this story makes sound like a graveyard of ships. Thompson said that, among the many vessels drifting silent and abandoned in the Sargasso Sea, was the still floating, but abandoned, City of Boston. Thompson eventually escaped the Sargasso Sea by harnessing the wind and erecting a makeshift sail in one of the Norwood's lifeboats, and he was rescued 3 weeks later. If this account is true, you have to wonder what he would have found on board had he ventured aboard her. Truthfully, no one knows what happened to the City of Boston, and we likely never will. Whatever fate befell her will likely remain a mystery. In my opinion, the most likely scenarios are sinking in bad weather or from striking an iceberg. A fire on the ship is also very possible. If any of those messages we covered were real is unknown, but if one was, then we have an idea of what might have happened to the ship. What do you think happened to the City of Boston? I'd love to know. On this channel, we've covered many ships that vanished at sea without leaving a trace. Stories like the Pacific in 1856, or the Lord Spencer, who likely smashed into another ship during a nighttime collision, or the White Star vessel Neuronic 20 years before the sinking of the Titanic, or the Waratah, also known as Australia's Titanic. But today, we're looking at the inverse of that. Ships that became wrecked, but no one knows who they are, what their stories are, where they came from, or who their crews were. Shipwrecks that just appeared but left us no traces about their origins or how they came to be in the places they were found. In some of these cases, it doesn't make sense that there's even a shipwreck where it is. It's weird that there's cases like this, and you have to wonder if there's any overlap with the missing ships we've covered in these cases. Okay, so this one is concerning. Like, there's no context, but apparently everyone was dead. This is the Orangutan all over again. Great. So, an unidentified ship was first sighted when it floated onto a reef near Mount Ernest Island. And then the very next detail is that everyone was massacred there. Yeah, Spino, this one jumps from 0 to 101 very fast. Like, that really is the next detail. There's like 3 sentences about this case because we don't know what happened. So, the solo occupant remained on the vessel after it struck the reef. Why there was just one guy, I don't know. Where was everyone else? Was the rest of the crew just gone? The next details of the ship, which I'm guessing given the time was probably a 3-masted sailing ship, or maybe something smaller like a schooner, drifted free at high tide and then ran aground on Mount Ernest Island itself. The vessel was then promptly looted, the sole remaining occupant was massacred, and that's it. That's the whole story. From reading the story, it sounds like it was just one person that was massacred when the ship actually drifted to shore, following striking the reef. By 1929, some of the timber of the ship could still be found along with its rudder, but there's nothing past that one mention. Alright, so let's break this one down. First, with how vague it is, it took me a few times to get the details straight. First time I read it, I thought everyone was dead when the ship hit the reef, but after rereading, I don't think that happened till afterward. I don't know, this one is super vague with the details, and is super strange. It's just a ship that was unidentified, and everyone died. Either way, everyone is dead and the locals looted the ship. The outcome is the same. I tried finding more information about this one, but there's just nothing. It's just a weird story of an unknown ship that ran ashore with a dead crew, and then the only one left was killed. Then the ship was looted and forgotten. To this day, no one knows who this ship was, where it came from, or where it was going. I can't even find a detail of what kind of ship it was. Now, looking at a list of missing ships, I can't even find one from the area that matches up date-wise. The nearest one is the missing Resolution in 1832, a decade off from this event. So, who knows where it even came from? If it wasn't local to the Australian region, which it doesn't seem like from, again, lists of missing ships in the area from the time, I checked all the local areas and there's nothing recorded, then it'd probably be impossible to track down due to just how many ships disappeared back then. It could have come from anywhere and been going anywhere. And I can't find an exact date either, a month and a day, just 1842. So that's kind of useless because there were literally hundreds, maybe even thousands of shipwrecks in 1842. Good luck narrowing that list down. I think the only way we would ever know is if an archaeological search for the wreck uncovered pieces of it and they were dated so we could get an age or even maybe even a location of where it was built. So looking at a list of known missing ships, I don't see any ones from the area listed as going missing around Queensland in 1842. And without further details, narrowing down a suspect from ships known to be lost in 1842 will be all but impossible. But let's look at a list that focuses on shipwrecks in Queensland itself and see if any occurred in 1842. So what do I think for this one? Well, assuming it wasn't the Kraken or the Sea Serpent the HMS Daedalus crew saw that resulted in the ship wrecking, I'm thinking probably pirates if the massacre occurred out at sea. If it happened after the ship ran aground, again, vague details, looters on the shore, land pirates. So, sea pirates or land pirates, they're all pirates. But this story is just one of 12 that we're covering. So let's move on and see if we can't have better luck figuring out who the next one is. North of Brisbane, Australia, is an area off Fraser Island known as the Breaksea Spit. In 1869, workers who were building a lighthouse were informed by the Aboriginal natives local to the area that there was a shipwreck about 4 miles from the Breaksea Spit. At the site, the remains of the ship were a timber hull, which was buried upside down in the sand, along with several other items such as tea, bars of soap, part of a box of candles, and bottles of gin. So it seems that it might not have been very recent, it might have been there a while, and if it was, then good reason to build a lighthouse, even though it's a bit late at that point. Though, considering the soap seemed intact, maybe it was relatively recent, who knows? It might have still been in boxes or heavily weathered, there's not many details about the wreck. The state of the soap, though, would give us a clue as to how recent it was, but we don't get that. We just get vague details again. I think this is going to become a pattern with these. I wonder if this one couldn't be, if it wasn't some cargo ship, then maybe it was what was left of a wooden-hauled passenger ship that disappeared around that time. We'll probably never know because despite everything found, the wreck was never identified, and even if it still exists is unknown. There might be some parts of it still buried in the sand if marine archaeologists would go look. That's the end of that story. Again, there's no date I can find beyond 1869, and again, that's a problem for narrowing down suspects because, like with the last one, there were literally hundreds of shipwrecks in 1869. There's like hundreds in December alone, and without a clue to the ship's identity, it could have come from anywhere. And that's assuming the ship sank that year when it was found, when in reality she likely sank sometime prior to that, which doesn't help. So cross-checking a list of missing ships again, there's some that are within a decade or two, such as the Phoenix in 1850, the Elizabeth Radcliffe in 1850, the Reindeer in 1862. The Burma was a passenger ship that vanished en route from London to New Zealand in 1859 or 1860, so that would at least put it on the right track to be in the area, except for the fact that it was way south of Australia. It'd be strange if it somehow ended up in northern Australia somehow. I don't think it would be anything older than those because of the fact the soap was apparently still in full bars. And it would have to be more recent if the soap was just lying on the sand, but I don't know if it was. But the fact that the soap was intact makes me think the wreck was relatively recent. So let's look at a list specifically covering known ships lost in Queensland, where Fraser Island is. For this, to help me out, we'll limit the years we'll consider to 1860 through 1869. So, starting off, scanning a list of known shipwrecks, there are literally none that match. I widened the scope and looked at a list of all ships lost in 1869. I really tried to find some possible ships this one could have been, but there's just no way to narrow it down just using 1869. Again, there were so many wrecks that year, it's literally hundreds per month. I really explored the lead that it could have been the passenger ship Reindeer, but I could find no information on that ship either. So, same deal, I guess. To possibly narrow down a point of origin, the wreck would need to be found again, and samples would need to be studied. I can't see this ship being one of the ones that vanished in the area decades before, like the HMCS Integrity, which maybe could have gone north around Australia while heading to Chile. Why they would, I don't know, when east is a straight shot. In my research, there was not a single ship I found that this could be. Nothing at all. What is this ship? Is this an Indiana Jones mystery? Because there is nothing on lists of missing ships that match, no known ships that were lost that match, and no ships known to have been wrecked in Australia even come close to the date. I feel like, with all that, it had to come from international waters somewhere, but where? That's the million-dollar question. This has to be one that was thought to be lost somewhere in the completely wrong area than it really was. That's the only conclusion I can reach from this. This ship was thought lost somewhere completely different than it actually ended up. My only real conclusion that I can make is that this ship was likely wrecked or capsized hundreds of miles away from where it ended up, and that is why no known missing ships or lost ships match with its location. In 1973, a piece of a ship was sighted off the shore at Orchid Beach in Australia. An unidentified vessel was spotted just offshore of the island. The wreckage included a cannonade and a timber spar. Today, the wreck is still there. It is buried deep beneath the sand, but occasionally does surface, with the most recent time being back in 2002. Given the fact that it had a cannonade, I'd say this might have been a Navy ship, likely a British Navy ship. So, let's check the list of missing ships again and see if we can find a suspect. The city of Holbert disappeared off Tasmania in 1873 and possibly could have drifted north, but I think that was a passenger ship, so I don't think that's our ship. The problem with having no idea of a year is that it becomes so difficult to find suspects. And once again, there were literal thousands of shipwrecks in the 19th century, which is when I'd guess this one is from. So I have no way to narrow it down without more details. It could have come from anywhere, been anyone's ship. The wreck is in Queensland, but even then it's hard to find a suspect. There were lots of Royal Navy ships lost in Queensland in the 19th century, most of which have documented areas they were lost in, and none match. A few are unknown, like the Lady Bowen in 1894, whose location is not known, and a few ships that were abandoned at sea could have perhaps drifted to Fraser Island and come to rest there, such as the Royal Navy vessel HMS Mermaid in 1829, which struck a reef and was abandoned, and as far as I know, not recovered. So maybe she drifted free and then sank here? Who knows? This is all guesswork based on the few details we have, which again is just timber and a cannon. But there is a silver lining to this story. Since this one still exists, for sure, it might be able to be identified, or at least narrowed down to suspects if it was dug up and studied. Maybe one day that'll happen, and if an area of origin can be narrowed down, or a date of loss can be narrowed down from analyzing the remains, then maybe we can narrow down a suspect from known ships that were lost in the area in the 19th century or the early 20th century. Finally, one that, while not officially identified, we think we know which ship this is. So, in 1976, a storm struck the Inskip Point and it exposed the remains of a 19th century wooden sailing ship. The wreck was between Rainbow Beach and Inskip Point, and it has been seen since its original exposure, as recent as either 2002 or 2003. The wreck is believed to be the bark St. Magnus, which drifted ashore following a storm just over a century earlier in 1875. On March 18, 1875, while on a voyage to Brisbane with a cargo of grain and produce, the bark St. Magnus was lost in a hurricane and buried on the shore after becoming wrecked. It is unknown how many of her crew perished in the disaster. But that's all there really is to say about this one. While not officially identified, it seems that most historians agree that the wreck is most likely the St. Magnus, so mystery solved for now. Well, this one's the opposite of the last one. There is literally nothing about this one. The only information is that in 1999, a wreck was reported to the Maritime Authority. And all it consisted of were several anchors, spars, timbers, chains, and a few other debris, and a sandstone ballast. Without any further details, such as a possible year of loss or just an age, it wouldn't be possible to even begin to try and narrow this ship down from those few details. The Independence was a ship lost in Australian waters in 1805, assuming that it was a 19th century ship. But again, there's no way to narrow down who it could have been from those details. Also, the Independence was lost way south of any of these wrecks. If the remains were analyzed and a date of sinking determined, then maybe we could narrow down suspects from known missing ships. But until then, we have no idea what her story is, along with the story and fate of her crew. Until we get a date, this one will remain nothing but vague details and a whole lot of unanswered questions. That's fair, Spino. But there's also the sandstone ballast likely means that the ship is way older than any of these other ones. Sandstone ballast tanks were like 15th century, so who knows where this ship came from. I'm just going to state the facts for this one because apparently there are no known ships that could have wrecked in this area at all. In 1999, a fisherman discovered this unidentified shipwreck on the eastern side of the North Ledge Reef. No records, though, we have explain why a shipwreck is here or where it came from. All we have are a heavily scattered debris field, some debris even getting as far away as 50 meters from the main wreck. The debris includes an iron ballast, a cannon embedded into the reef itself, which makes me think maybe a World War I era battleship. There are also iron fittings and an iron water tank that sits just above the waterline. Haha, very original, Spino. That's all the details, though. Who the ship is unknown. There are no theories. An unknown wreck was found at the Jervis Reef in 1999, not to be confused with a wrecked French ship that rests on the northern side of the reef. This one rests on the southern side of the reef, and all it consists of is an anchor chain and stone ballast. Great. Like with some of these previous ones, without analyzing the remains and determining an era of loss, or even an age, or, year of construction, anything, narrowing down suspects is impossible. It could have wrecked any time, and we've established how many ships were lost in the 19th century alone. This one is probably older though. The stone ballast makes me think something between the 15th and 19th centuries. You know, which also doesn't help narrow things down. We really need a year of lost to have a hope in identifying this wreck, or, you know, at least narrow it down. Without that time frame, I can't do much when it comes to checking lists and looking for suspects that match. Until then, there's just no story with this one, and no way to try to reconstruct one or theorize about one. You know, without a year of loss, we really are groping in the dark. With some of these, we can narrow down an estimated from details of the wreck, but with such vague fragments being all we have left of this one, we can't even begin to guess until it's further studied. At least with a year to go on, we can look at ships lost in the area and try to guess which one it might have been, create a suspect list. Until then, we're just going to have to move on to the next one. Yeah, me too, Spino. On an island only 1 mile long is the remains of an unknown wrecked ship. Found in 2000, an iron-hulled shipwreck was located off the island, 7 meters below the surface of the water. Though technically still unidentified, this one is the second wreck we've covered that has a likely candidate for which ship it is. Which, after those last few, is nice. It is believed that this ship is the iron-hulled vessel Gertrude, a ship lost near the island in 1912. The wreck itself consists of an intact bow, which actually sticks out of the water at very low tides. There was also an anchor still attached to the bow as well. Some other pieces of the wreck that remain are sections of the ship's iron hull and various other pieces of the ship's structure. I really tried to find details about the Gertrude, but there's nothing that I could track down. Even on websites that archive shipwrecks, there's nothing. Even the Queensland Australia Museum didn't have much about it. But either way, the ship is believed to be identified, though it's not officially identified. It seems that this is the only one it really could be. There are literally no other known candidates for who it could be, so let's move on to the next one. In 2004, a wreck was located offshore of the Pearling Station at Goods Island, an island in the Torres Strait of Islands. This one is intriguing, but again, it is a case where we know absolutely nothing, which is starting to drive me mad. There's no details about when it possibly could have sank that we can use to narrow down which ship it is out of the literal thousands it could be, but what's interesting is what the wreck consists of. The wreck consists of stern posts, wooden ribs, hoop pine wooden planking, and what really got my attention, something a little more tangible than timber and an anchor. There is what appears to be a diesel engine in the wreck. That is interesting, and that is something we can start with. Diesel engines got widespread use on ships in the very early 20th century. 1903 is when the first diesel engine came into use on a ship with the diesel-electric river tanker Vandal. So, we can assume this wreck likely comes from sometime in the early 20th century, between 1900 and, we'll say, 1920. So, what ships disappeared in Australia around this time? We'll start this little investigation by assuming it's a ship that is missing and not one that is known to have sunk. The Amy Louise is a ship that disappeared in 1909, somewhere between Brazil and Sydney. Could the ship have gone around the northern side of Australia and gotten wrecked? I can't find any details on the Amy Louise, like if it was a sailing ship or a steam engine powered ship, so I'll leave that one in the maybe pile, and probably not pile as well. There's a lot of ocean that one could have disappeared in. But after checking the list of known missing ships, that's the only one that really fits. A lot disappeared around Tasmania at this time, but that's not where we're looking. So we'll assume it's a ship that is known to have sank in the time frame. There's still hundreds it could be. So we're still in the same boat. We can only narrow it down to probably the early 20th century for when it sank. Until it's properly studied and dated to a likely year that it sank, I don't think I can riddle this one out when there's hundreds of suspects, but the diesel engine being in the wreck is very interesting. I read through a whole list of shipwrecks in Queensland to see if I could find which one this was, and it's not any of them. Then I did find something. In 1923, the wooden-hulled coastal steamer Douglas Mawson disappeared in the area where this wooden, unidentified wreck is located. I'm just throwing that out there. What if this unidentified wreck is that missing steamer? That's a little too much of a coincidence for me to just write off. So, with that little intriguing head scratcher at the end there, I'm going to move on to the next one. The final and most recent one on our list today. Resting some 30 meters off the shore from Hinchinbrook Island are the remains of a wooden ship, the wreck of which is some roughly 30 meters long. That's 98 feet if you live in America like me. It's okay, I didn't know either. So, wooden ship, suspected to be from the 19th century. Well, once again, we have a familiar problem. The fact that there's literal hundreds it could be. Literal hundreds! I get why these haven't been identified. The suspect list is longer than the RMS Titanic itself. Heck, printed out, it would probably be longer than all 3 Olympic-class sisters lined up bow to stern. I wish I could tell you the story of this ship and these others, but it's hard when there's literally hundreds that it could be. Yes, Spino! Okay, let's at least check and see if there are any missing ships from the 19th century that it could be. Let's check the list of missing ships. I feel like these wrecks are more likely to be in this category because if it was a known ship that went down, we would have an idea of a ship being in the area. And someone also would have had to have lived to tell the tale. But if it's a missing ship, then no one lived to tell the tale. And we have some that might fit the bill. The Amelia, a wooden brig from the early 19th century, comes to mind. She was lost in 1816 on a trip from Sydney to Java. And I put her on this list because she would have likely swung up around Queensland on this voyage. Since we do not know where she was lost, perhaps her crew navigated her to this island because of an issue, or she simply became wrecked there while on the voyage. There's no way to know. There is no way to know who this ship is with only a wooden wreck being what we have to go on. If it was studied and an age or date of loss could be narrowed down or heck even determined, we could at least begin to narrow down some suspects. But until that happens, this ship's identity will remain unknown. Imagine if it was the Amelia, though. Man, that'd tell a story. But it's probably not, for the simple reason of, once again, there's several hundred possible suspects for this wreck's identity. Looking at a list of known wrecks around Queensland, I can't find a match from known ships that have gone down around the area either. And I want to address this little fact now that we are at the final shipwreck of today. I don't think any of these ships are ships that are known to have sank, because no one survived to tell where these wrecks were or who they are. I think most of these are missing ships that disappeared and took all hands with them, or ships that were abandoned and drifted to these places where these wrecks are. But while I can't be sure about that, it makes the most sense to me over them being ships that were known to be lost in specific sinking situations. I think to find the identities of these wrecks, we need to look for known ships that went missing or ships whose records just kind of abruptly end, kind of like the Hurricane from our last missing ships video. I plan to keep looking into these. Maybe I'll even do a process of going through the literal hundreds of suspects with the ones on this list I found most interesting, and in a few months I'll come out with a part 2 on my suspects of who these wrecks are. Until then, though, let's wrap this one up. And those are the unidentified shipwrecks of Australia, and all the information about them that we have. For many of these, I wish there was more to cover about these ships, but there's just not. Since they're unidentified. I'll leave that little blooper and you might laugh. Since these are unidentified, their stories are unknown. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed the video and what little information about these ships that we have. I find this whole phenomena really interesting. It's one thing when a ship disappears and is never found, but it's a whole other thing when we find wrecks, but we don't know who they are or where they came from, or how they got there. It's just strange that this can happen and their whole story not be known, or their origin not be known, or anything about them. Heck, some of the ships we covered that disappeared might be on this list that we just went through. Again, the Madagascar vanished sometime after leaving Australia, so who knows? I wish I could have really narrowed some of these down, but unless you have a look at the list I was looking at, I don't think you can understand just how hard that is. When I say thousands of ships were wrecked, hundreds per year, hundreds per month on those lists I was looking at, that's not a joke. And in these cases, when we have just timber and an anchor that, could have been down there for over 100 years, it's impossible to narrow down the suspects without having them analyzed and getting a time frame for the sinking, or a possible location of origin or a date of at least being built. If I do my proposed project of trying to narrow down some of these, I'm only going to do it with the ones that we have more details about, like the split apart steel-hulled ship, the one I thought could be the Douglas Mawson, and so on. And not any of these that all we have is a mast and an anchor to go off of. By the way, I got very excited when I made that connection to the wreck at Goods Island with the Douglas Mawson. Like, I wish you could have seen my face when I was writing the script. I was, like, jumping. I really did get super excited for that, and it felt like the mystery was actually getting solved for me there. I swear, if that wreck ever gets identified as the Douglas Mawson, I will have the greatest "I called it" moment of my life. Anyway, this was a really interesting topic to research, and if there are more unknown wrecks around the world like this, I would absolutely love to cover them. Let me know if there are other lists like this one that exist. And with all that said, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found these mysteries interesting and that you'll like and subscribe if you did, because it really does help me grow and lets me know that you like this content and you want to see more like it. Passenger ships, warships, clippers, freighters, ancient vessels, the first submarine built for combat. All very different and unique ships, sometimes separated by centuries, but united by one fact. They all disappeared at sea. Today, we are going to be covering the stories of more than 10 very obscure ships that either vanished completely or became lost through known means, but have never been found again. One of these even lies somewhere very close to the wreck of the RMS Titanic. Our 10 stories today will be a collection spanning from the 20th century all the way back to the 12th century. Built in 1850, the Sea Serpent, I love that name, was an extreme clipper. She was 215 feet long and had a beam of 39 feet. This three-masted vessel was one of the longest-lived extreme clippers, serving 36 years and 9 months before encountering her mysterious fate. Her career was an eventful one. She raced the large merchant vessel Staghound and John Bertman from New York to San Francisco in 1851. The Staghound ultimately won this race by completing the journey in an impressive 107 days. The Sea Serpent came in after 125, due to a layover en route for repairs that cost her 8 days. Sea Serpent was originally built by the United States, but in 1874 she was sold to Normandy. Once she was under her new owner, she was renamed to the Progress. She kept this name until 1891, when she would go missing. On June 12, 1891, while on a voyage from Dublin to Quebec with a cargo of timber, she was suddenly abandoned at sea by her crew, and the rough coordinates of this occurred at 46 degrees north, 40 degrees west. Why her 17 crew members abandoned her, I don't know, but they left the ship for the lifeboats and were picked up by another vessel shortly afterward. For a while, the state of the ship was unknown until October 18th, 1891, when she was sighted by another vessel at 45 degrees north, 24 degrees west, 1,120 miles from where she had been abandoned, making that epic trek in just 93 days. After being abandoned, the empty ship was spotted drifting 19 times, before utterly disappearing, and to this day she has never been seen again. Where she went down is unknown, as is the location and state of her wreck. What fate ultimately befell the sea serpent is unknown, and she will likely remain missing forever, unless, as I mentioned in past videos in this series, her wreck is happened upon by chance. But until then, the sea serpent was reclaimed by the sea. Tell me, where do you think the sea serpent could have ended up, or what caused her to sink? Bad weather? Striking something? Disrepair? Maybe she was even captured by someone. I'd love to hear your theories on what happened to her. When people think of romance and sea, most probably think of Titanic in the 1997 movie, and not the ship literally called Romance of the Sea. Like the last one, she was a clipper, the last extreme clipper built by the California Trade, that was launched in 1853. Also, coincidentally, a century before an earlier movie about the Titanic would be made. The Romance of the Sea was 240 feet long, and she had a beam of 36 feet. She weighed 1780 gross registered tons, and on her bow was a figurehead described as, quote, a small female figure, intended to represent romance, with the name of Sir Walter Scott on one side and James Fenimore Cooper on the other, the greatest romances of the century, end quote. Her career lasted 9 years, but she lost that figurehead after 3 when she encountered a storm. She made 6 round trips from various North Atlantic ports and many more around the world. Some of the places she visited included Boston, San Francisco, New York, Shanghai, the Dutch East Indies, Liverpool, Hong Kong, and it was that last one where she was en route when she vanished and was never heard from again. The cause for the loss is completely unknown, but somewhere on her 7th voyage, the Romance of the Sea was lost, and to this day her wreck has never been found. All hands were lost with her, and they all utterly vanished. What the story of her final voyage was is a mystery lost to time. This was long before wireless technology was even a thing on ships. Who knows if everyone went down with the ship, or if they drifted for weeks out in the ocean before dying. You never know. None of us will. The ocean swallowed all of those stories up and holds the answers close, and as time passes, the answers only become all the more far away and mysterious. Perhaps she encountered bad weather or wrecked on an island somewhere. We can only guess. The Gertrude. A very quick story with almost no information about it, but one that I thought I'd share since that's what this series is all about. I happened upon this one while researching for the last video, the Unidentified Shipwrecks of Australia, and I decided to share it. The Gertrude was a coastal cargo ship of British nationality. She was a steamship launched in 1873 that weighed 212 gross registered tons. Her crew was 17 individuals. In 1912, the Gertrude left Hull for Weymouth, carrying a cargo of coal within her, and she disappeared. We now know that the cause for her disappearance was that she ran aground and all 17 crew members were lost with her when she became stranded on Race Bank. Other than that, there isn't much information about her that is easy to dig up. So, let's move on to the next ship. This is one that we will have a little bit more to say about. If you've watched the Unidentified Shipwrecks of Australia video, you'll recognize this one. In that video, I theorized that one of the unidentified wrecks could be of this ship, but I didn't talk much about the ship itself, so let's actually do that. This is the story of the Douglas Mawson. The Douglas Mawson was a coastal steamer from Australia. This wooden-hulled vessel was built in 1914 and could achieve a speed of 8 knots, or 9.2 miles per hour. She was 141 feet long, or 42 meters, and one of the first duties she was assigned was weekly trips under her captain, Captain Donovan, to Nambucca Heads. She was well suited for the area due to her light draught, and she could better navigate the Nambucca River bar than other ships could. In 1916, now under another captain, she was used to carry cement from Geelong to Tasmania. She was later taken over by John Burke and Son for the Gulf trade operations, and some thought that she was a poor choice of vessel for the job. And perhaps their fears proved right. That backstory brings us up to March 28th, 1923, the day that she was last sighted. Earlier, the SS Douglas Mawson had left Burketown for Thursday Island with 20 people on board, 13 crew and 7 passengers. The only passengers on this voyage were a single family, Mr. and Mrs. Williott and their 5 children. On this voyage, she was under the command of Captain George Finch Toone. The ship left, but she never arrived. Somewhere along the way, she vanished. It's theorized that she might have been menaced by a cyclonic storm somewhere in the Gulf of Carpentaria. She was last sighted by the Aborigines from a beach on March 28th. In May, some wreckage was found, but it has since been proven to not have come from the Mawson. What happened to the ship is unknown, and so is the fate of everyone who was on board her. And as you'll know from the Unidentified Shipwreck video, I think that her wreck might actually be at Goods Island. We know that the ship was last seen in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and that island that the wreck is on is just northeast of there, at the tip of the Cape York Peninsula. An unidentified wooden shipwreck is there, just off the island, and in my research for that video, this is the only known ship that really matches the wreck's description, and it's in the right area too, so who knows? The Douglas Mawson might actually be found, but until that wreck is studied in detail, we'll just have to still list her as missing, and the location of her wreck as being unknown. If it is her, how she would have ended up there is completely unknown, given that her last reported sighting was much further south. It would be interesting to see where she really is, and if she is indeed at Goods Islands, or somewhere else. I'd just like to see her found. Also, the debris that was found, which turned out not to be from the Mawson, were located on Prince of Wales Island, which is coincidentally very close to Goods Island. So if the ship there isn't the Mawson, maybe these debris came from it. There is a whole lot of unanswered questions with this one. So, let's cover one that's not so mysterious. The MV Blythe Star was a 144-foot-long vessel who disappeared near Tasmania in October 1973. She was on her way from Hobart to King Island, carrying a cargo of beer and fertilizer, so all the party supplies, when she suddenly capsized and sank. After 7 days of searching with no traces of the ship being found, her crew were presumed dead, but as it turned out, they all escaped on emergency inflatable life rafts and survived. 3 of the 10 crew members died, but the others were found 12 days after the sinking, having made their way to a shoreline in Tasmania and finding people who could help them. After this, for nearly 50 years, the wreck of the ship was missing. No one knew where she ended up after going down. The fate of the ship itself was known, but the location of her was not. This year, in 2023, researchers from the CSIRO and the University of Tasmania set out on a 38-day voyage on board a vessel called the RV Investigator to study an underwater landslide. But after that, they turned their attention to something else. An unidentified shipwreck had been reported by fishing vessels in the region. The shipwreck turned out to be the MV Blythe Star. She was finally found after being missing for almost 50 years. Lying under 492 feet of water, she is intact and resting upright on the ocean floor, resting about 7 miles east of the Southwest Cape in Tasmania. The ship itself is in decent condition, but she has suffered from some damage. For instance, her wheelhouse is completely gone. With the location and identity of the wreck determined, government officials and researchers hope to find out just why she abruptly capsized and sank all those years ago. She was found, her location is now known, and she is no longer missing. Unfortunately, this next ship doesn't have such a storybook ending. Very few of the ships we've ever covered in this series do. Like the Blythe Star, the reason that this next one sank is known, but what is not known is the location of her wreck. The Hoop was a ship built way back in 1597. Well, look at that, another Titanic connection. 400 years to the year before the 1997 movie. Fine, Spino. You know, I should have called you the Let's Have No Funosaurus. The Hoop was in service from 1597 until her loss in the Pacific Ocean in 1605. She was built for the United East Indian Company and served as a frigate. She left with a fleet that, after a series of misadventures, ended up just down to 2 ships, the Hoop being one of them. Both were en route to Japan, and the Dutch were actually one of the few outside countries allowed to bring goods and trade into Japan during their long isolation in the Edo period. There was one little island that they could dock their ships on without actually going onto the mainland. After they arrived in Japan, the 2 ships then made to carry on for Hawaii on September 24th. Now, I'm going to be clear about one thing. I'm finding 2 different dates here for her loss, either 1600 or 1605. I'm going to be assuming that it's 1605. That seems to be the more common one, but it also could have been in 1600. I just want to clear that up and cover my bases. The years don't remain consistent between accounts, but the year also doesn't really matter because the end result is the same. En route to Hawaii, the 2 ships became caught in a severe storm. In this storm, the Hoop was lost and all 130 hands went down with her. The other ship survived the storm and limped away, afloat but badly damaged. The cause for the loss of the Hoop is known, but where exactly the ship went down is unknown. The ship disappeared in the storm and was never seen again. The other ship that she was with was lost in 1605, which might be where the conflicting date for the Hoop actually comes from. But no matter the date, the Hoop disappeared in that storm, and she took all of her crew with her. Where her wreck is, or what state it's in, if it even still exists, is unknown and will likely remain unknown. The most ancient one of the ships we're covering today is the White Ship, a vessel which sank and has never been found, officially anyway, since November 1120. Yeah, we're going back almost 1,000 years for this one. The White Ship was a notable vessel, as it was tasked with transporting many nobles of the ancient world. And I don't know if it was tasked with this on this one occasion that it went missing, we'll get to that, or if it was a ship designated for specifically transporting the ancient elite. Either way, she would sink on the 25th of November, 1120, and this is the story of her loss. The vessel was newly refitted and captained by Thomas Fitz-Stephen. The fact that the ill-fated ship was refitted makes it sound more like a charter vessel than one specifically used by nobles, in my opinion, but I suppose her job could have just been used to transport the higher class around in general. Captain Fitz-Stephen offered King Henry I of England the use of his ship on the return to England from a visit to Normandy. Henry himself had made other arrangements. A good choice in hindsight. History might have been a little bit different if he was also on the ship. Enjoy my little stutter right there. This ship's also about to have a pretty big stutter. But the king did allow many other important people, including his heir, his other illegitimate children, and many nobles to take the vessel home. Around 300 people were on the ship when it left. Others, including the future king Stephen of Blois, left because of how much drinking everyone was doing. More on him in a bit, by the way. In what I'm guessing was an intoxicated move, the passengers prompted Captain Fitz-Stephen to try and overtake the king's ship, which had left hours earlier. The White Ship was fast, and the captain felt confident that they could reach England first in this race. So at the fastest speed they could go, they sailed off into the night and were never seen again. While out in the English Channel, very shortly after they had left the harbor, the ship suddenly struck a submerged rock on its port side and began to take on water. She then very quickly capsized and sank with everyone on board, save one survivor, a butcher named Berold. Berold was very lucky, but he also had to tell the king what happened. Others initially survived when the ship capsized, including King Henry's heir, William. William escaped in a small boat before the White Ship sank, but he turned back to rescue his half-sister after he heard her calling out amid the calamity, but his boat was swamped and he was drowned with everyone else. Captain Thomas Fitz-Stephen surfaced as the ship sank, but after he learned that the king's heir had not survived, he let himself drown rather than face the king. Others who drowned included the ship's reportedly drunk helmsman who was at the wheel the time the collision occurred, the other 50 crew members, many more family members of King Henry I, members of the royal household, nobles of England, nobles of Normandy, 2 clergies, and family of the Emperor of Rome. You know, the ship almost was one that disappeared. Only one person survived, and if they died too, then we probably wouldn't know why this ship never arrived. It would be just another mystery of the many that haunt the ocean and those who travel across it even to this day. Today, and through past centuries, the ship has held on to a bit of a legacy. Historical writers have published works about it, historical fiction authors have as well, and the ship has been subject to several works of poetry. I personally found this story to be very interesting. I'm surprised it's never been made into a movie, honestly. It has a lot of potential drama. This will probably be my favorite of the video, but, we have a few more to cover. It's definitely had the most information to comment on so far, which is nice, and it was overall just a very interesting story. It's cool reading some of these stories from so long ago. But anyway, let's move on to the next ship. Another with a connection to the Titanic. Okay, Spino. The repercussions of the sinking of the White Ship were drastic. The death of King Henry's heir caused a civil war in England known as the Anarchy. The disaster left Henry with one legitimate child, a daughter, but she was not popular with several circles, and she was also a woman. And at this time, no woman had ever ruled England, despite King Henry wishing her the title of his heir. The barons didn't like that. So, when Henry died 15 years after the sinking, his barons were reluctant to accept his daughter as heir to the throne. Eventually, a relative of King Henry, Stephen of Blois, usurped Matilda along with his older siblings to become king. Remember that guy, the future king I mentioned? Yeah, it's reported that he was actually among those who was going to be on the White Ship, but he left right before it sailed. Stephen's usurpation of the throne was challenged by King Henry's daughter, Matilda, and her husband, Geoffrey, and this started the Anarchy, a direct result of William's death in the White Ship's sinking. An account of the White Ship disaster written in the 13th century reads as follows. No ship that ever sailed brought England such disaster. None was so well known the wide world over. There perished then with William the king's other son Richard, born to him before his ascension, by a woman of the country, a high-spirited youth whose devotion had earned his father's love. Today, the wreck is actively being searched for by historians and archaeologists. A candidate for the remains of the White Ship have been located, and evidence proving if it is or isn't the White Ship is currently being searched for. Alright, something much closer to the modern day. The SS Edward Y. Townsend. This 603-foot-long vessel was a freighter that served on the Great Lakes, and also came to rest somewhere in the North Atlantic Ocean, very close to a famous shipwreck. How did that come to be? How did she go from Great Lakes bulk carrier to ship missing at sea? This is the story. She was built in 1906 and would remain in service until 1968. In 1909, she collided with the steam vessel Phillips Minch in Lake Superior, but the damage was only minor. This wasn't the only event of note in her early career. In 1926, she ran aground in shallow water off Buffalo, New York, due to low water levels. She was laid up in Lake Huron for 2 years after suffering severe damage in a storm on the lake in 1966. In 1968, she was finally sold to a Spanish scrapyard, and in September of that year, she began the long voyage across the ocean, being tugged by tugboats. On October 1st, she cleared Quebec and had only the open ocean ahead of her. However, here's where she went missing. A storm struck her and the ships tugging her along when they were 400 miles south of Newfoundland. She broke free in the storm and was never seen again. Where she sank is unknown, but her undiscovered wreck likely lies somewhere very close to the RMS Titanic, as the place that she broke free and was last seen in is very close to where the famous liner sank in 1912. Though, until the Townsend is found, the exact distance between her and the Titanic will remain unknown, it is likely that she rests somewhere not too far away from the Titanic. The storm swallowed up the Townsend, and to this day, she has never been seen again. Sometimes, when a ship disappears, we can kind of explain why, even without many clues, such as bad weather or drifting abandoned at sea and eventually losing its battle with nature. But sometimes there's absolutely nothing to clue us in on what caused her to disappear, as this next case shows. An anchor line vessel built in the early 1850s, this transatlantic passenger liner was 214 feet long and weighed 886 gross registered tons. She was built for sailing before being converted into a screw-propelled steamship in 1856, 2 years after she was launched. Her transatlantic route took her across the ocean from New York to Glasgow. However, her maiden voyage saw her travel from Glasgow to Bombay. Her first Glasgow to New York crossing began on October 11, 1856, and then she safely returned to Glasgow after a 28-day crossing. Her second trip saw her leave Glasgow on December 27th with 50 passengers on board. She safely arrived in New York after this voyage as well. On February 13th, she departed with 150 people on board, along with only one passenger. On this voyage, she disappeared without a trace, and to this day, her fate and the fates of those on board, as well as the cause for the loss, all remain unknown and likely will forever. Overall, there's not much information about this story. I found this one really interesting, though, maybe because there was just one passenger on the ship. It makes you wonder what it was like to be the one person on a ship with the crew, and it would be kind of cool to have a whole passenger ship to yourself. It's kind of one of those things you kind of fantasize about. And you also have to wonder how the crew roused them when whatever calamity occurred. Given the time of year, if I had to guess, I'd say the Tempest likely struck an iceberg, but ultimately we'll probably never know for sure. But given where she was crossing, and again, the time of year, running afoul with an iceberg seems like a very likely explanation for the loss. Perhaps one day we'll find her wreck and get answers, but this one will likely always remain an unsolved mystery. This next one is also an example of a ship sinking because of unknown causes, but it is also a ship that is significantly more famous than this lost passenger liner. Time for another ancient one. The Xi'an ship was a 14th century sailing vessel built for the Yuan dynasty of China, which lasted from 1271 to 1368. She was 32 meters in length and had a beam of 10 meters, and the original name she had has been completely lost. She was part of a fleet when she was lost near the Xi'an Islands, South Korea. She sank in 1323 and was lost for over 600 years before being found again in 1975. This is the story of the ancient vessel that disappeared. The Xi'an ship rests on a spot designated as a historic site in South Korea. When discovered wrecked off the coast, the theory put forth was that she was part of a trade fleet between ancient China and ancient Japan. What happened to those on board is unknown. It is likely that no one from the 14th century ever knew what happened to this ship. She vanished from their knowledge, and ours, until she was found again in 1975. Its excavation was the first underwater excavation of its kind in South Korea, and the wreck housed many hundreds of treasures and artifacts, weighing a total of 200 tons. The process of unearthing this ship was difficult due to how murky the water was, but the wreck itself has been titled the richest ancient shipwreck yet discovered. Though we know from an earlier video in this series that an even more wealthy one is out there somewhere. If you know which one I mean, you've been paying attention. The underwater excavation of this shipwreck led to many advancements of underwater archaeology in Korea itself. There is a lot of really fascinating information about this ship that exists, and I highly encourage you all to read some of it. But in interest of not straying too far off topic, I'm not going to cover some of the excavation information and how she is where she is now, along with the cargo. I'll end this section with this, though. Why this ship sank while traveling is unknown. Perhaps she ran into foul weather or became wrecked in shallow water. Either way, she vanished for centuries before she was finally found again and remembered once more. But it makes you wonder, how many ancient shipwrecks should be on our list of missing ships? With these bonus stories, I tend to cheat and only cover something that is technically on topic. And this is one of those. In this case, we know what happened to this vessel. She didn't vanish like the others, but did in a different way. The remains of this vessel have not been found, and the story is fascinating, so I thought I'd cover it as this video's bonus topic. Yes, thank you, Spino. That's what I just said. The Turtle was the world's first submersible vessel that saw use in combat. While one might think of the American Civil War as an example of early submarines used in combat, this one predates those by around 90 years. The Turtle was built in 1775, and her purpose was to attach explosive charges to the bottoms of British vessels during the American Revolutionary War. I just gotta say it, that is awesome, and the fact that they thought to do something like this way back then is just cool. This is the story of the Turtle and how she became lost. The Turtle was a tiny little thing, 9 feet long and with a beam of 3 feet rounded up. We don't know much about the inspiration for the sub, but we know how effective it was. She was built by David Bushnell, and as the first submarine to serve in combat, her role was to attach explosives to the undersides of British ships anchored in New York Harbor. Every attempt failed, so big F on that science project. Fair, I'll even give him a D+ for the ingenuity. The Turtle had a long development period and preparation period before seeing any use. Her target was a ship called the HMS Eagle, a flagship vessel of the blockade squadron in New York. She was a symbol of power, and the colonists of America knew that if they could destroy her with a submarine, the British morale would take a huge blow, and British control of New York Harbor would be threatened. So, when she was ready, she was towed to New York, and her operator, Ezra Lee, prepared to attack the Eagle. The plan failed. Lee only had 20 minutes of air, and the conditions of the harbor, the darkness, and difficulty maneuvering the vessel combined to keep him from completing the task. While ingenious in concept, the Turtle was a failure of a craft. Her story could make an entire video. And if you're curious and interested, let me know and consider this a teaser for it. Now, on to the fate of the Turtle. As with these bonus stories, again, I tend to cheat and include a story that only technically fits within the concept of the video, like the Extreme Clipper Hurricane in the last one, and the Turtle is no different. She simply vanishes from history, and what her fate was is unknown. But it is thought that she was intentionally destroyed to keep the British from getting their hands on her.
The USS Wasp. Yes, Spino, it is a good name. The USS Wasp was a ship that served in the United States Navy in the early 19th century during the War of 1812. Despite this being only decades into the existence of the United States, she is actually the 5th ship to already bear that name. The first sailed back in 1775 and was lost in 1777. The Wasp of the early 19th century was a sloop of war constructed at Newburyport, Massachusetts in 1813. She was launched in September of that same year, and then her commission began in February 1814. The Wasp sailed out into 2 successful raiding voyages against British trade ships during the war. One of the Wasp's big accomplishments came about when she happened upon the HMS Reindeer out at sea. Remember, the United States and Great Britain were at war at the time, so this was not a friendly encounter. In the following 19-minute battle, the British crew tried to board the Wasp several times, but the American crew pushed her back each time. Around the crew, bullets and cannonballs were flying through the air and tearing into each ship. Wood splinters would have been flying everywhere, and smoke would have been filling the air with each gunshot or cannon explosion. Finally, after a 19-minute battle at sea, Wasp's crew boarded and captured the Reindeer. Wasp took 6 hits to her hull in the battle, but was still able to sail. Talk about a tough girl. Reindeer, meanwhile, had 42 crew wounded and 25 killed, including her captain, William Manners. The Wasp took the British crew as prisoners, and once they were off, Reindeer was left abandoned without a captain or crew. The American crew also set fire to the reindeer as they prepared to sail away, and shortly after, the vessel exploded. From there, the Wasp set a course to France. Wasp was a short-lived vessel, but her history is incredible. There's more battles and epic stories to tell, but in the interest of keeping to the topic and not making this video an hour long, let's move on to the fate of the Wasp in autumn 1814. The actual topic of this section. The Wasp lived up to her name. Multiple vessels felt her sting, but in the end, being a vicious hornet could not save her from a mysterious fate. In September 1814, the Wasp came upon the 8-gun brig Atalanta and captured her. Wasp's crew deemed her too valuable of a ship to scuttle, so they sailed together for a time. On October 9th, 1814, after parting ways, around 3 weeks after her capture of the Atalanta, and while that vessel continued on to the United States, the USS Wasp spoke to another ship, the Swedish vessel Adonis, who had left Rio de Janeiro for Falmouth, England. They exchanged customary information, and Wasp in turn told the other vessel that she was en route to the Caribbean. And she was never seen again, as far as anyone knows. If any other vessels sighted her or encountered her, these were not recorded. Wasp's fate remains unknown to this day. One of the only theories that we have is that she encountered and sank in the storm. No matter the explanation or theory, the cause of the Wasp remains a mystery to this day and will likely remain a mystery forever. Though she had an active, if short, role in the War of 1812, she is not remembered by most. Today, she is all but forgotten. The actions of her crew, stories of anarchic calamity or selfless bravery to the very end when whatever fate descended upon them, all went down with her, and those secrets have never been given up. Our first story today takes us way back into time to two brothers, explorers and merchants, who vanished at sea in 1291. Vandino and Ugolino Vivaldi are not widely remembered today, but at the time they were known for being among the earliest to search out into the Atlantic Ocean away from Europe. These two sailors were brothers, explorers, merchants, and they attempted a voyage from Europe to India via Africa. This is the voyage that they disappeared on. But first, let's cover a little backstory about them. Italian merchants Vandino and Ugolino Vivaldi were part of the first known expedition in search of an ocean way from Europe to India. The brothers were in command of this voyage. Their little fleet consisted of 2 galleys, a type of ship that is propelled by mainly oars and manpower. The purpose of the voyage itself was to reach India by the Ocean Sea. Not sure why they called it that, but once they crossed the Ocean Sea and reached India, they were hoping to bring back useful trade to Europe. At the time, it would have seemed like India was a world away, so I can understand that this was a major deal and there was a lot of excitement and intrigue for people back then for this voyage to be successful. So the voyage set off, and it went well at first. They reached the southern coast of Morocco with no issues. This voyage was also the first one to set sail out of the Mediterranean and into the vast Atlantic Ocean since the collapse of the Roman Empire around 800 years earlier. So they headed out into the mighty Atlantic. And here is the mystery. They were never seen again. They vanished on this voyage. 22 years later, a Genoese expedition set sail to try to find the brothers, but no traces were found. And the son of one of the brothers also set out to look for his father and uncle in the early 14th century. And they reached as far as the Somali coast on this voyage, but tensions in the region prevented him from being able to go any further and search for them. The explorers are never found, and their ultimate fate remains a mystery to this day. Throughout the later years, even as late as 1455, the mid-15th century, rumors of their fate persisted. There were even sailors who claimed to have met the last descendants of the survivors of the voyage out in far-off lands. But this story should be taken with a grain of salt, as there is absolutely no way to verify it. But the story this supposed last descendant told was that the 2 ships were lost in the Sea of Geneva, and those who escaped, whatever fate befell the ships, were stranded and later held in captivity elsewhere in Africa. At the time, their disappearance was a big deal. Think of it as the Mary Celeste of its day, and legends which were passed around told of the brothers sailing all the way around Africa and being held captive by mythical kings in the east, such as Prester John, a legendary ruler whose kingdom was lost amid religious turmoils in the Far East. I want to offer up a little theory of my own before we end this story off. Their goal was to explore the Atlantic Ocean, go around Africa, and reach India. So who is to say that maybe they didn't veer away from Africa and out into the west? Now, they were going around Africa specifically to explore the coast and reach India, so probably not, but just come with me here for a minute. I have an interesting idea, even if it's just a what-if theory. So what if on this voyage, they maybe reached their goal, or chose to reassess while sailing down the coast of Africa? Then, what if, maybe, thinking they could find another way to India over the Atlantic Ocean, instead of going around Africa, they headed west? So who's to say that if this happened, maybe they didn't reach America, and then maybe died here or on the return trip to Europe? Most likely this isn't the case, and the most likely answer is they encountered some hazard at sea near Africa and were lost. Maybe wrecked on the rocks of some isolated shore, and those who made it to shore later died out in the desert or grassland wilderness. Skeleton Coast in Africa is known for all the shipwrecks there, after all. And some areas around there are also known for treacherous waters, bad weather, and rogue waves. But it is an intriguing theory to think about. What if they felt the open ocean, a straight shot to India over it, was better than a treacherous trip around Africa? No one knew a continent was in the way, so what if they thought it would be a longer trip, but going straight over the Atlantic to India would be safer? Longer voyage, yes, but maybe a less hazardous one. Because you see, even back then, they knew how big the Earth was, so they would have known it would have been a longer trip, but again, maybe they thought it would be a safer one. Just think about it. Open ocean with no threats ahead, or a super dangerous ocean around the coast of Africa where it's known to be violent? It just makes you wonder, what if? At the very least, it could make for a very cool speculative film or book. But either way, on that voyage, the two brothers vanished with their ships and their crews, and they have never been seen again in over 700 years. Now I get it. These two lived getting close to 800 years ago, and to us, they're just distant names in history. They might as well have lived on a completely different world than we do now, considering how people lived in the 13th century versus how we do in the 21st. But these two were people. Once as alive as you and me. It's just as important to keep that in mind. Sometimes you can forget that when they lived so long ago, when they're just names from centuries ago. Long ago days we'll never know. But they lived on the same planet as we do, and their story should be told. It's up to us to remember what came before, no matter how long ago it was. A 1,000 miles from nowhere, inhospitable, cold, volcanic. It's about as isolated as you can get. No one really goes there, or wants to go there. You don't want to be there. If you get stranded there due to volatile weather, you're done. You don't want to go to Bouvet Island. You don't want to be there. It would be hard to get there. But someone did. In the 1960s, a lone lifeboat from an unknown source was found on the shore of Bouvet Island. Some lost soul had found their way here. This is the mystery of the Bouvet Island lifeboat. In 1964, a survey team from the HMS Protector landed on the island via 2 helicopters to survey an area of land created by a lava flow in 1954. While the survey was ongoing, one individual happened upon something on one of the island's beaches. a single, empty lifeboat. The survey team found it in a small lagoon which had been formed by the same eruption that created the lava flow they were investigating. Due to the threat of potential bad weather to literally come out of nowhere, they didn't have much time to look into it. A picture was taken, a quick search for signs of human habitation or survivors was made, but nothing was found, and they left. The team's lieutenant commander, Alan Crawford, was the one who initially found the lifeboat and took the picture. There were also some oars on the shore that were found, no motor or sail to accompany the boat, but there also was a barrel and flattened copper tank. A later team that arrived on the island reported that the boat was gone. So, this story stirred up a lot of urban legends and myths and fictional stories of where it came from, and some even, as I can't say it with a straight face, some even going as far as to saying it was from a Nazi landing party in the 1940s, looking for the entrance to the Hollow Earth. Yeah, did Indiana Jones also come to stop them? Another popular theory was that it was the sole survivors of a ship, which had vanished at sea and found their way to the island where they met some ultimate unknown fate. But this is also not the case. So, if not a Nazi landing party looking for Agartha, or some unfortunate castaways from a ship that went down, what was it really? Who were the unfortunate souls that found their way to such an inhospitable place? Well, the mystery has been solved. One of the few in this collection of obscure historical mysteries that has been. I realize I've been focusing on unsolved or merely unresolved ones, but I don't really have to. Any obscure mystery is fair game. So, let's have one with a resolution. The answer to this one, it wasn't World War II related, but it was Cold War related. So, you could maybe write a Cold War thriller about it. Soviets looking for the entrance to Agartha, I guess. Because, yes, the lifeboat was from a Soviet Union ship. A Soviet reconnaissance vessel, to be exact. Page 129 of Transactions of the Oceanographic Institute, published by Moscow in 1960, appears to explain the whole story, and a Reddit user translated it as the following. The scientific reconnaissance vessel, Slava 9, began its regular 13th cruise with the Slava Antarctic Whaling Fleet on the 22nd of October 1958. On the 27th of November, it arrived at Bouvet Island. A group of sailors landed, and then couldn't leave in time because of worsening weather conditions and stayed on the island for about 3 days. The people were withdrawn by helicopter on 29th of November, 1958. So, unless the Soviets were lying and covering up something else, the mystery is solved. Who knows what they were looking for? Maybe they really did find the entrance to the Hollow Earth on this little volcanic island, and those who did were never heard from again. It writes itself. Seriously, is creativity really that hard, movie writers? I came up with that after 2 seconds of brainstorming. Someone get on this one too. I'd totally go see this movie. With all the ships that vanished utterly in the ocean that we've covered, vessels lost forever to those dark depths where anything could be, are y'all afraid of the ocean yet? No? Well, you're about to be because we're talking real-life sea monsters, things that did lurk in those unknown depths and came to the surface. Sometimes, mysterious animals wash ashore and baffle people, or reveal themselves as strange noises picked up on hydrophones that baffle and terrify us. We've talked a lot on here about things that vanished into the ocean, but today we are looking at the weird, mysterious things it spat out. That's right, globsters. The weird sea monster-looking carcasses that get spat out of the ocean, rarely resembling known animals in any way at all. And people like to use these, and other examples, as proof of unknown animals or once extinct animals still living, when in reality they can be explained. Often, in fact, the answers aren't very alien at all, despite the mystery that first pulled us into the sea appearing very much to be. Today we'll get up close and personal with some of these cryptids and go over what they in fact really are. But first, what is a globster? Well, I'm glad you asked. A globster is an unidentified blob of organic mass, or the remains of an ocean animal that washes ashore. Okay, with that simple definition in mind, let's get to it and start with one of my favorites, the Stronsay Beast. This beast has the honor of being perhaps the very first recorded globster in history, at least modern recorded history anyway. The Stronsay Beast washed ashore in, guess where? Stronsay Island in the Orkney Islands, part of the Northern Isles of Scotland, on September 25th, 1808. What people found when they came down to the beach that day was a massive, dead, unidentifiable carcass of an ocean animal not resembling anything known to science at the time or even now. The massive carcass reported was very long and thin, serpent-like almost, as you can see from the pictures, with 3 sets of legs, and it measured around 55 feet long. That's 16.8 meters for everyone outside of America. This description paints a vivid image and makes this globster become one of the most interesting in my opinion. Again, it doesn't sound like anything that exists today or existed anytime in prehistory. Honestly, it almost sounds how I'd expect 65 would have depicted a plesiosaur given how faithful to the other animals they depicted were. The Stronsay Beast overall gives me Loch Ness Monster vibes, even though this long predates the modern Loch Ness Monster legends. The corpse was first spotted by a fisherman before it washed ashore, who noted the circling seabirds and he saw the massive animal lying on its belly from a distance. 10 days later was when it washed ashore, and the same people, and 2 others who had no recorded names, came back to take another look. Other details of the carcass included it being 4 feet wide, being covered in a filament-like furry coating. At the end of each of the 6 legs was a paw or wing, the end of the tail was also missing, and the skin was smooth to the touch. Whatever was in its stomach was also red. It also had a row of bristle-like spines going down the back, now making me think of the hybrid dinosaur version too, from my own original writing. Cool. The spikes were also described by some eyewitnesses as having bioluminescent properties when in the dark. Okay, so we have a description of the beast, from which the 2 depictions you see on screen were drawn. We can cover what happened next now. Scottish naturalist Patrick Neal was so impressed with the Stronsay Beast that he designated it with its own scientific name. This abomination of a word you see on screen now that I will now both try to pronounce and simultaneously butcher. Halcydrus papatoni, I don't know. Only 4 people saw the actual carcass before it rotted away, and none of them were scientists, and photography was not even a thing yet, so no pictures exist unfortunately. But a few pieces of it were salvaged. They were given to proper scientists and quickly found to be cartilaginous, like sharks. It was also found that the legs were in fact fins. Going off this, scientists quickly deduced that the animal was likely a heavily decomposed basking shark. One whose size was either much larger than an average individual or was simply mismeasured by the amateurs. It is also believed that the long neck was the result of the gills and bottom jaw sections falling off. As you will see later, this does result in the illusion of a long neck and small head. In 1849, Scottish professor John Goodsir in Edinburgh came to the same conclusion that the corpse was a basking shark. Surviving bones, like a few vertebrae, available for study today, also lead modern scientists to the same conclusion, that the beast was merely a basking shark. Eyewitness testimony is, of course, the least reliable form of evidence, and many more of the fantastical aspects of the description can be dismissed, as again, the remains we have available for study today prove it was a basking shark. Some traits on the bones of the beast we have features unique to basking sharks. Also back then, the average person could not really look up what a decomposing basking shark looks like, and to them one might very well resemble a sea serpent. And, as you'll see in some more of these cases, basking sharks tend to fool people a lot. And let's just assume the spikes were actually glowing on the back, and ask how. Well, giving the benefit of the doubt, they said they only did it in the dark, so I'd say it was an optical illusion, a wet carcass reflecting the moonlight. Seems like a good answer to me. It's hard to find information about this one. This one is very tricky to research. Reliable information seems almost non-existent from what I could find. But I think I can deduce what it is. Look at the body shape. Look at the head shape. Look at the legs. It's a basking shark. The dorsal fin The tail, the size, the head shape all fit. It's the legs that throw people, but first let's get some context here. From what I can gather about the backstory of this thing, people chased and shot it with muskets until it died and drifted ashore. Or they chased it ashore, maybe? Maybe. The newspaper from the time I looked at is clipped really weird, and I don't know if the article I was reading is related to the picture. So let's assume it was, and that's how the wonderful fish came to be on the shore and examined by gawkers. It washed ashore on Moose Island, Maine, at the border of Maine, basically where the US-Canada border is. Like, seriously, it's almost on the line. Now, how do I know it's a basking shark? Well, again, look at the body shape, but the legs can also be explained. They're just the shark's freakishly long claspers. Like, seriously, I've seen a picture of these claspers compared to a human. Good lord, it's scary. And they look like legs. I'm not putting it on screen so you can sleep tonight. Let me just say you better hope you're never in the water with a basking shark that thinks you're a good potential mate. Be like that one episode of The Simpsons involving the panda that traumatized us all. I mean, just look at it for a moment anyway. You can just tell. From the shape of the head or the dorsal fin, the mouth, even the nose shape has the same little indent or ridge, I'm not sure exactly what you'd call it, that basking sharks do. It's the exact same. All modern investigations and scientists have reached the same conclusion. It's just a shark. A whale shark, I suppose, might also be possible, but as no remains exist anymore, a basking shark is the more likely candidate based on the drawing, and I'd agree. Again, just going off the illustration and comparing it to a basking shark, it looks way more like one than a whale shark. And basking sharks do exist in that area of the world. To me, a basking shark is what it looks like, especially with the nose and head shape. But I'll admit either could be possible. Either way, that's all the wonderful fish ever was. Just a shark. Almost certainly a basking shark. No Spino. Washing ashore, not in St. Augustine. The St. Augustine monster washed up in Florida, near St. Augustine, but not there. It washed up in Anastasia in 1896, and is possibly the most famous globster to ever wash up in the United States. This thing caused a huge sensation when it washed up. So, we have a lot to go over with this one. This case also clearly shows how eyewitness accounts and drawings can be very misleading. You'll see why. First, the full backstory of this sea monster. She washed up and was first sighted on the evening of November 30th, 1896. Two boys discovered this rotting, fleshy mass half buried in the sand, having sunk under its own weight. The two went to St. Augustine the same day to report what they'd found, believing it to be the remains of a whale. Founder of the St. Augustine Historical Society and Institute of Science, Dr. DeWitt Webb came out to investigate the carcass, and was the only person of academic science to see the remains in situ. He theorized the remains were of a very mutilated animal in advanced stages of decomposition. The carcass he investigated was pale pink, almost white, and composed of a rubbery substance that had a hard consistency. It was around 18 feet long and 7 feet wide. Webb estimated its weight at nearly 5 tons and believed, after his initial investigation, that it was the remains of a 4 to 5, maybe even 7 armed octopus. Under this giant octopus theory, the species that the carcass was thought to represent later went on to be named Octopus giganteus, meaning giant octopus. Dr. George Grant, someone not of academic science, wrote the following account and description. Quote, "The head is as large as an ordinary flour barrel, and has the same shape as a sea lion head. The neck, if the creature may be said to have a neck, is of the same diameter as the body. The mouth is on the underside of the head, and is protected by 2 tentacle tubes about 8 inches in diameter and about 30 feet long. These tubes resemble an elephant's trunk and obviously were used to clutch, in a sucker-like fashion, any object within their reach. Another tube or tentacle of the same dimension stands out of the top of the head. 2 others, one on each side, protrude from beyond the monster's neck and extend fully 15 feet along the body and beyond the tail. The tail, which is separated and jagged with cutting points for several feet, is flanked with 2 more tentacles of the same dimensions as the others and 30 feet long. The eyes are under the back of the mouth instead of over it. This specimen is so badly cut up by sharks and sawfish that only the stumps of the tentacles remain, but pieces of them were found strewn for some distance on the beach, showing that the animal had a fierce battle with its foes before it was disabled and beached by the surf." Unquote. This version definitely added some liberties to the story. The carcass was eventually pulled back out to sea by the tide, but it floated back to shore on the next tide at Crescent Beach, 2 miles south of the original place it washed up. It continued to be a sensation, and investigation into the identity of the mass continued. Professor Addison Emberley Verrill of Yale, the man who basically knew more about cephalopods than anyone else in his day, first suggested that the remains could be a giant squid, but he quickly changed his mind. He eventually was able to study samples sent to him by Webb, and he concluded that the creature could not be an octopus. He added to his conclusion that the carcass was merely the upper part of the head of a sperm whale, detached from the skull and jaw. So that's it. That's what all this sensation was about. It was never the Kraken. It was just whale blubber. Webb decided that the carcass should be moved before it was lost to the sea forever. Using 6 horses and strong tackle, they moved it several miles inland. There it continued to be visited by hundreds of people, but what ultimately happened to it remains unknown. If I had to guess, I'd say it was just left there until it rotted away completely. But no one knows for sure what actually ended up happening to the carcass. For decades, photos of the carcass were lost, but were recovered almost a century after the event in 1993, and because of that, we, and you, can actually see some of the real photos of the carcass. I'll show you one right now that has a really good sense of scale to it. The same year that the movie The Lost World, a classic film featuring adventurers finding living dinosaurs in South America, released and stunned audiences, something many thought might have been a dinosaur or other prehistoric animal washed ashore on Moores Beach. Oh boy, let's break this one down because, yeah. Why do people always go for something being a dinosaur or a plesiosaur, even before the Loch Ness Monster just, stole all that thunder? The Moores Beach monster washed up in 1925 on what is now known as Natural Bridges State Beach in California. This dolphin-looking thing confused people, really confused them, and all kinds of theories began going around, including one that continues to be spread to this day, that the corpse was that of a plesiosaur, either one frozen or otherwise preserved since the KT mass extinction, or proof that they survived until much more recent times. Well, no, for many reasons, even if somehow it was frozen for 66 million years. Even frozen bodies only a few hundred years old are not in any kind of pristine condition, like this thing seems to be. So even if it was frozen for 65 million years, I can imagine what state it would be in. Just look up pictures of the people buried by the Franklin expedition. They've only been down there for 200 years, and they're preserved, but they don't look like they died yesterday, like this thing pretty much does. Also, for an even bigger reason, this thing looks nothing like a plesiosaur. It's clearly a mammal. Also, the corpse was very long and snake-like. Again, not sounding like a plesiosaur at all. As you can see, many photos were taken of the odd animal, and descriptions of it included it having a duck-like beak and serpentine body. Yeah, it really sounds like a plesiosaur now. Other reports also said it had a fish-like tail as well. Also, some people reported that it had legs, but I have no idea what those are supposed to be. They aren't visible in any photos. Some reports, though, went on to say that the legs resembled that of an elephant and were complete with toenails, and that the carcass even had feathers, though none are visible in the photos either. The only real consistent details that are supported by the photos are the small eyes, the long beak, and the serpentine body. Any of you still want to die on the "it's a plesiosaur" hill? Well, I'm about to ruin your day if you are, because we not only have the skull of this animal preserved on display for the public and available for study today, but we also know exactly what the animal is. Modern and past scientists, some of those past scientists even saw the animal on site and immediately identified it, agree that it is, drumroll somebody, a deceased, decomposing Baird's beak whale. A dolphin-looking whale that is very rarely seen, and that gets up to 43 feet long. They have a serpentine body, like the one the monster had, and the long beak. Again, the skull of the animal was also saved, preserved, studied, and removes any doubt that the creature was anything other than a Baird's beaked whale. Any marine biologist will look at it and tell you it's a Baird's beaked whale. Also, if that wasn't enough for you plesiosaur components, the animal had no teeth and a beak. All plesiosaurs have teeth and did not have a beak. And if you're somehow still on the plesiosaur hill, look at the skull of the monster, then look at the skull of the plesiosaur, and then look at the skull of a Baird's beaked whale. That will say it all. And again, marine biologists unanimously say it's a whale skull. I'm sorry I have to keep saying it, but some people I've seen really want to die on this hill. They will fight you to extreme limits, so I've just got to get the point across. A similar incident to this one also happened a few years earlier in 1920, also in Santa Cruz, but it did not gain the sensationalism that this one did. In that incident, the corpse that washed up was in much better condition and also a Baird's beaked whale. The image that goes with this one is a classic internet picture. I remember seeing it when I was a really young kid and I thought it was a movie monster. I specifically remember I was looking at pictures of graboids and other monsters from the Tremors series, so it was probably around 2009 when I first saw this picture. It's a classic picture for a good reason. It definitely grabs your attention. This very decayed, large, monster-looking corpse with a serpentine body, rotten flesh hanging off, and teeth bared in a final snarl was found on a beach in Sakhalin Island. Shocking, I know, with a name like the Sakhalin sea wolf. The bones and teeth were quickly determined by scientists to be not from a fish or any kind of crocodile or alligator. The skull resembled a canine, and the rear resembled a fish. Well, despite the well-known legacy of the image and this strange mix-up of features we're dealing with, the answer is not nearly as exciting as a hybrid sea monster made in the lab, which I actually think was a conspiracy theory. Let me tell you what it really was. Further study by scientists proved that this animal was just a decayed beluga whale. The shape of the jaws feature a formation seen on those animals. Like with all these globsters, this case clearly shows that when something is severely decayed, it looks like something completely different than it would have when alive. All you need to do to ID this one is just look up the jaw structure of a beluga whale, and you'll see the exact same little indent on the upper jaw you see in the upper jaw in the picture of this globster's open mouth. Ah, that's a whale. Like, look. Whale. That's all that needs to be said. It was a whale. A bride's whale specifically, but a whale. Not much to discuss here. Marine biologists who examined the carcass at the time all agreed it was just a decomposing bride's whale, with the supposed tusks you see on the monster just being the bottom parts of the jaw you see in the skeletal image on screen now. That's all it is. It's just a whale. Oh boy, I've been looking forward to this next one. It's not only one of my favorites, it should also be a familiar face. We've seen this one before, way back in the Loch Ness Monster documentary. This is arguably the most famous dead animal corpse ever found in the ocean. This is one of those cases where the carcass doesn't resemble a known animal, and people constantly think something fantastical instead of something that's a little bit more grounded in reality. People just claim that this is proof of unknown sea animals or extinct animals without anything to back it up. So take a look at the picture. Yeah. So, where was it found? What's the story? And what is it? Well, unlike the last one, we have plenty to go through here. A Japanese fishing trawler, the Zawayo Maru, plucked this thing out of the water off New Zealand after snagging it in a net that was over 980 feet deep in the ocean. When they hauled the net up, this massive carcass was revealed to be tangled in with the rest of the catch. The crew immediately all thought they'd snagged the remains of an unknown animal species from the depths of the ocean. That or a big turtle with no shell. The carcass was in advanced stages of decomposition, but the flesh and muscles were decently intact, enough to hold it together suspended above the deck. Its internal organs were all gone, and its body was hollowed out and apparently reeked. It also had 4 reddish-colored fins and a 1.5 meter, or nearly 5 feet, long neck. Fearing the thing, this giant, rotting, stinking corpse, would contaminate their entire catch, the captain, Akira Tanaka, ordered it dumped overboard despite the excitement of the crew at possibly finding an unknown animal species or the biological significance of such a find. But samples were collected and photos were taken before this was done. The incident got widespread attention, started a plesiosaur craze, and the fishing company ordered all of their boats to try and relocate the carcass, but it was never found again. The ocean is a big place, after all. This story sounds like the opening of a Godzilla movie. Now, something I addressed in the Loch Ness Monster documentary that I have to readdress here is this. No, this thing was not a plesiosaur. People love to say that this thing was a plesiosaur. Admittedly, it does kind of look like one. So many people try to claim that this is a late surviving plesiosaur, it's kind of wild actually. That'd be really cool, but no, it's not. Now look, I'm a prehistoric animal fanatic. My avatar in these videos is literally a Spinosaurus. I'd love it if plesiosaurs were still around post-KPG, or simply KT as I referred to it earlier, extinction, but they're not. Even though scientists at the time first described the carcass as not a fish, whale, or any other mammal, we thankfully know what it was. You see, before they dumped it overboard, the Zoimer's crew collected not just photographic evidence, multiple photos were taken from several angles around the entire specimen for thorough documentation, and sketches of it were also drawn, but also samples from the animal, including from its skeleton, skin, and fins, were collected for further study by experts back in Japan. Measurements were also taken of the animal before it was dumped overboard, and it was about 10 meters, or roughly 32 feet long, and weighed 4,000 pounds, give or take. And with all that data, we know exactly what the animal is. It's something very familiar and not so prehistoric. Look, if plesiosaurs were still alive, we would know. Not necessarily because of the fossil record, but they breathe air. They'd have to surface all the time, like dolphins or whales. It would be impossible for us to have never seen them. I get that the ocean is huge, but even sometimes the most elusive animals that breathe air still get spotted. Sometimes 50 years goes by between sightings, but they do get seen. The lack of plesiosaurs popping up to breathe air today is very telling. The oceans have been free of them for 66 million years, since the Cretaceous. So what was the carcass? A basking shark. The amino acids from the samples collected by the crew prove it. Other marine biologists also agreed. Another reason it's not a plesiosaur, far too vertebrae in the neck, even for a short-necked plesiosaur. The carcass also perfectly matched the body dimensions you'd expect to find on a large basking shark. The reason that it looks like a plesiosaur is that it's so decayed. The bottom jaw has either completely fallen off or is actually still hanging around in the mess in its chest. It looks like it might be if you look closely. But the dorsal fin and other shark-like traits, like the gill area, do fall off very quickly after death and will be long gone by this point of decomposition. Again, resulting in a plesiosaur-like look. With the corpse in this advanced of a state of decay, how it looked when alive would have been very different to how it looked when it was found. The head shape and size also do not match any known plesiosaur skulls. Despite that not so incredible explanation, this story does remain a popular legend today and has left an impact on pop culture. In fact, an incident inspired by this story was even considered to be the opening scene for the Lost World Jurassic Park before it got reworked into the Compsognathus attack we all know opens the movie and the final film we have today. We've covered the really famous ones, so these next ones are going to go by a little bit quicker, but this is also one that is still relatively famous, so let's talk about it. Our boy Trunko. Trunko is the name for this blobby, lumpy, hairy white carcass that washed up on a beach in Margate, South Africa on the 25th of October 1924. It was initially described as a fish like a polar bear, and was reportedly seen viciously fighting for its life against two killer whales for hours, using its tail to attack them with powerful strikes, lifting itself out of the water by 20 feet for each attack. Finally, it seemed to lose, and shortly afterward washed ashore and laid there for about 10 days. But no scientists or anyone with academic knowledge on marine animals ever arrived to investigate the carcass. It was described by eyewitnesses as an animal covered in thick fuzzy white fur and having a trunk like an elephant. Some also reportedly said that its tail resembled a lobster's. No samples were taken, it wasn't properly measured or weighed, but in this picture you can at least see something when it comes to its scale since there's a person next to it. Speaking of pictures, the carcass was, in fact, so poorly documented and studied that no pictures were thought to exist of it until around 80 years later, when this one that you see and 3 others were rediscovered. These photos actually showed us that the fur was actually connective tissue fibers and not fur at all. Okay, so it had no fur. But what was Trunko? Well, paleontologist Darren Nish said this on the matter. The photos show that it was the rotting carcass of a large vertebrate, most likely a whale. The idea that this was really the body of a white-furred, trunked sea monster stems from naivete about the appearance of rotting animal carcasses. The photos are somewhat ambiguous, but the enormous bulk of the carcass, the large amount of what looks to be frayed, badly decayed collagen, and the presence of what seems to be a mostly obscured internal skeletal framework suggest that this is another globster, a rotting mass of whale tissue. Whales are common in that region, and the decaying blubber of one might have made for an appetizing meal or just a fun toy for some killer whales to amuse themselves with for a while. Other scientists have suggested a basking shark or whale shark as being a candidate as well. A basking shark in particular because, as we've covered, the bottom jaw and gills fall off quickly, so that could result in the neck being misidentified as a trunk. But I'll agree that, no matter which of these 3 it was, Trunko is the corpse, or part of one, of a known animal and not a representation of a completely unknown genus of marine mammal. The real identity of which animal it was will likely never be confirmed, again due to the poor documentation and study of the carcass, but without extraordinary evidence, it's going to be hard to make an extraordinary claim. Unless something more comes out of this, like another picture, I'll take the dead whale piece explanation put forth by people much more knowledgeable in the field of marine animals than I am. It's the blob. Like, seriously, this thing looks like it wants to eat you. I don't know why, but the thing in this picture just feels threatening. Thank goodness it was just a dead pile of blob. This globster, like basically all of these, was originally unidentified due to how severe the decomposition state was when it was discovered. It was found washed up on a beach in New Zealand in 1965. Nice to know rotting corpses washing up still mystify people like they did 150 years before this. There isn't much of a dramatic story to go with this one, though, like some of those early globsters from the 19th century or the early 20th century. It was identified very quickly as, quote, a very dead, very smelly whale. I love this next one. It mystifies me. It is an ongoing mystery that is unfolding right now, but I don't see many people ever bring it up. The ping. A short topic, but I really wanted to talk about it. The ping is a sound coming from the Fury and Helka Strait. It is also known as the hum or the beep. This seemingly inconsequential phenomena is unexplained. No one knows the source or what it is or where it is coming from. It is a noise that was heard throughout the summer of 2016, and it supposedly scared the marine animals out of the strait. Hunters noted that there was a dramatic decrease in marine animal game that year. It has been described as an acoustic anomaly whose sounds scare sea animals. An airborne survey of the area was conducted by the Canadian military authorities, but they found nothing unusual, and no sign of Allied or foreign submarine activity in the area. No one was supposed to be there either, based on their intelligence. The sound is currently being investigated by the Canadian military authorities. Currently, there is no explanation for what the ping was. Okay, let's start with the first one. Julia. Julia is what sounds like an ocean creature's roar. It was recorded on March 1st, 1999. I just gotta say, can you imagine your job being to listen to the hydrophones? It's early morning, you're barely awake, and suddenly that blares through your headset? Talk about frightening. So what made this roar? What was Julia? Well, first, the location it originated from was not narrowed down that much. Like, half the Antarctic coast was all listed as an area it might have originated from, specifically somewhere between the region of the Bansfield Straits and Cape Andre. Good luck narrowing that down. Julia was most likely the sound of a large iceberg running itself into the ground off the coast. While Julia does sound like the roar of a giant sea creature, and heck, I use it for creepy ambience all the time in videos, I'm not an expert into what hydrophones are, or the sounds that they record, or what sounds the ocean makes. So if the experts say it was most likely an iceberg running aground, then that's what it most likely was. I'm not going to be the guy who claims it's something else other than what the experts say, just because I think it sounds like something different without having the knowledge of hydrophone sounds to back my point up. Though it sounds like a roar, Julia was most likely an iceberg running aground somewhere off the Antarctic coast. But it would be really cool if it was some giant gargantuan sea creature. How's that not an awesome thing to imagine? The next one I played was a portion of the 7-minute sound called Slow Down. This roar-like noise is possibly my favorite underwater noise ever, the sped-up version anyway. At original speed, it's probably Julia. Slow Down, recorded in 1997, is named as such because the sound decreased in frequency over a period of 7 minutes. So what slowed down? What was slow down? Why does it sound like a giant monster moving and roaring? Well, it was also an iceberg. A particularly large iceberg, most likely, that became grounded somewhere in Antarctica. The sound matches frequencies caused by friction, and scientists have concluded that the most likely explanation for slowdown is that the noise was created by a very large iceberg becoming grounded. However, one thing that is odd about slowdown, it repeats. It's been recorded several times since it was originally heard in 1997, so giant sea creature might still be on the table. Fingers crossed! On that ominous note, let's move on to Upsweep. The sped-up version sounds like a whistle or alarm almost, and while the original almost sounds like the screams of the damned, which is nice. Upsweep, like Slowdown, also repeats. It's seasonal and has been heard every year since it was first picked up in NOAA's Equatorial Autonomous Hydrophones in 1991. The sound can be heard on hydrophones throughout the Pacific Ocean, and it reaches its peaks in frequency in autumn and spring. But the reason for this is unknown. The sound has also declined in volume, but it can still be heard on hydrophones today. The source is unidentified, but its location has been pinpointed to a region around 45 degrees south, 140 degrees west in the Pacific Ocean. The only real theory scientists and NOAA researchers have is that the noise is underwater volcano activity that has been ongoing since 1991, but to this day, no one truly knows what upsweep is. But considering it never moves, I feel pretty confident in saying it's not a sea monster. Maybe one day we can go there and send an ROV or other submersible down and have a look. Our final noise of the day is definitely the most famous, the bloop. You've probably heard the story. The noise was so loud it was heard on hydrophones more than 3,000 miles apart. Fun fact, I've heard Julia at its original speed be used as the bloop before by some people. Whoops. So what was the bloop, and when was it heard? Bloop was heard in 1997, and after the hydrophones picked it up, the source was triangulated to a remote point in the South Pacific Ocean, west of the southern tip of South America. The sound was heard more than once and, quote, rises rapidly in frequency over about 1 minute and was of sufficient amplitude to be heard on multiple sensors at a range of over 3,100 miles. So, Godzilla or something else, you're asking yourself. Admittedly, the frequency and audio profile of Bloop resembles a living creature. Oh boy, it's Sawaya Maru's daddy, or mommy. Another thing that made the detail of it resembling a living creature noteworthy was because it would have had to have been several times larger than the largest creature living ever, the blue whale. Well, once again, I'm no expert and don't claim to be, but there is no evidence Bloop was a giant sea creature, as awesome as that would be. There's no extraordinary evidence for this extraordinary claim. Plus, if it was alive, it would have been heard again. Like, if it's an animal that's that loud, it would have been picked up again. NOAA scientists have attributed the sound to being from a large ice quake. Other loud ice quakes result in noises very similar to Bloop. If icebergs were the origin of the noise, the exact location of them is unclear. We just have a general region of the ocean for a reference.